Perched atop Kiev's skyline, the Motherland Monument stands like a sentinel guarding over the city. Once adorned with a hammer and sickle representing the Soviet Union, its wings and insignia now transform into a trident, a symbol deeply embedded in Ukraine's national heritage. This deliberate reimagining is far more than cosmetic. It is a visual testament to Ukraine's firm determination to sever the umbilical ties with its Russian past. The symbolic change represents a call to embrace a future that is uniquely Ukrainian, one that aligns more closely with the ideals and sensibilities of the West. But Ukraine joining the Western sphere, more precisely NATO, would revolutionize the geopolitical map. Russia would be placed in an irreversible chokehold. Its demographic and industrial core, situated in the European part, would be militarily outflanked on land, air, and sea. Russian defense spending would surge to accommodate the new reality, but it wouldn't do much good. The war in Ukraine shows that sometimes fairy tales are true, not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten. Last week, NATO announced its biggest military exercise since the Cold War against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. According to the military committee, 40,000 soldiers will exercise in Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. That's a big deal. On ground news, I can see that over 40 sources are reporting on this. 50% of them lean right, making this a potential blind spot for the left. Looking deeper, I noticed that left-leaning sources directly state that the exercise is intended to prepare for a potential Russian invasion on member countries, while on the right, the first two sources I see are media outlets owned by the Russian government. Their coverage highlighted negative comments from the US military committee chair and furthered the narrative that NATO expansion is one of the main reasons behind the military operation in Ukraine. I appreciate that ground news includes these sources, while also noting their affiliation, as many social media companies and news aggregators have removed Russian sources from their platforms, wiping this information from the record and leaving us in the dark about their motives. Knowing how the news is presented is just as important as the news itself. I want to thank Ground News for sponsoring this video, and I highly encourage you to check them out as a resource. CaspianReport viewers get 30% off their unlimited access plan using my link. We live in an increasingly complicated world, and it's about time we modernize the way we read the news. For centuries, Ukraine has served as a dynamic crossroads between Eastern and Western civilizations. Its history is a complex tapestry of cultural, historical, and political influences. Its landscape, however, is predominantly flat. What mountains it has are found solely in the west, specifically in the Carpathians and along the coast of Crimea in the south. The rest of the country is as flat as imaginable. A vast expanse of flat and fertile terrain stretches across the territory, a palpable manifestation of Ukraine's unique role as a connecting thread between diverse worlds. The landscape consists of sprawling plains, known as steppes, which extend like an enormous patchwork of golden wheat fields and green pastures. These agricultural riches have not only shaped Ukraine's economic fortunes, but have also irrevocably linked its destiny to that of its neighboring countries. This exceptional geography has lent itself to Ukraine's historical role as a setting for trade, cultural exchange, and unfortunately, conflict. Interestingly, even the lexicon reflects this complex and multi-layered identity. The name Ukraine derived from the Slavic word that signifies borderlands, which, once again, underscores its enduring role as a strategic buffer. The contrasts within the state are vividly striking. In the western reaches, the city of Lviv serves as a tangible testament to Ukraine's deep-rooted European connections. With its cobblestone streets, Baroque and Renaissance architecture, and a culture steeped in Western European traditions, Lviv feels like a slice of Europe tucked away in Ukraine. On the other end of the spectrum, in the east, lie cities like Donetsk and Luhansk, which share stronger cultural and historical ties with Russia. The influence of the Russian language, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and Soviet-era industrialism permeate the region, offering a different panorama of life. Sandwiched between the two is the capital city, Kiev. Charged with the task of bridging the chasm between regional identities, Kiev stands as a microcosm of Ukraine's complex national tapestry. With its iconic golden dome churches and bustling modern boulevards, the city embodies the intricate blend of Eastern and Western influences that define Ukraine. Amidst these regional currents, however, lies a larger geopolitical reality. The same flat plains that cover Ukraine also sweep across Belarus and into Russia. Ukraine's literary, artistic, and intellectual contributions have seeped across its borders, leaving an indelible mark on Russian society. Shared folklore, language nuances, and creative expressions have cultivated a unique cultural synergy. Today, institutions like the European Union and NATO, with Poland often leading the charge, regard Ukraine as a pivotal battleground to contain Russian influence. However, this strategic maneuvering belies the complex historical and cultural ties that intertwine the fates of these neighboring nations. Without any distinguishing geographic features in between, the national boundaries of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are often seen by the locals as simply lines on a map, just ink on paper and nothing more. That has been the traditional mindset. The flat plains that extend into Russia form the backbone of the Russian core, which stretches from the cultural metropolis of St. Petersburg to the historic city of Kazan to the trade nexus Volgograd. This vast region houses most of Russia's population and serves as the epicenter for policy decisions from the Kremlin. But the very flatness of this terrain creates nearly insurmountable vulnerabilities. As the extensive plain unfurls eastward, it leaves Russia exposed along a 2,000-kilometer spread. This spatial expanse complicates safeguarding Russia's territorial security, demanding an enormous commitment of both manpower and financial resources. No other nation on Earth has a military vulnerability of this scale and magnitude. The economic strain induced by these military commitments siphon off vital resources from other crucial sectors, undermining Russia's overall strategic posture. The flat Russian core places the country in a tough spot. Moscow must continuously grapple with the enduring implications of historical border revisions, all while striving to maintain a semblance of security along its lengthy borders. Seen in this way, the loss of the Soviet boundaries cost the Russians dearly, both politically and economically. Russia finds itself obligated to maintain a gargantuan front line adjacent to some of the world's most technologically advanced military forces. It has been a costly status quo. When it comes to Ukraine, however, the stakes accelerate exponentially. Directly to the east of Ukraine's border, the rolling landscape continues uninterrupted for 750 kilometers to the city of Astrakhan by the shore of the Caspian Sea. This territorial stretch of land is known as the Volgograd Gap. For the Russian state, few regions carry as much strategic weight as this corridor of territory. If a foreign power were to gain substantial influence over Ukraine and consequently secure the ability to close off access through the Volgograd Gap, the implications for Russia would be catastrophic. It would effectively cut Russia from places like the Caucasus, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. Such a move would relegate Russia to an increasingly vulnerable geographic core, essentially turning it into a more isolated and encircled entity. This scenario would not just compromise Russia's regional aspirations, it would also pose an existential threat to the very integrity of the Russian Federation. By closing the Volgograd Gap, a foreign power could potentially create a strategic choke point, rendering Russia susceptible to foreign intervention and destabilization. It wouldn't be just a strategic setback, but an unparalleled crisis that would question the very survival of the Russian state as we know it. And this isn't just speculative theory. During World War I, Germany aimed for strategic mastery over Ukraine with the express intent of exploiting the Volgograd Gap as a means to compel Russia into a humiliating capitulation. During World War II, the Germans tried again and made it as far as Volgograd City, known back then as Stalingrad. Russia's survival hung on a knife's edge until long after the German invasion was repelled. And even after the hostilities were said and done, the fact that a foreign army came this close to destroying Russia left a deep impression on the national psyche. Fast forward to the present day, the security of the Volgograd Gap is etched into Russia's DNA. This is not merely a matter of territorial integrity, but an issue that strikes at the core of Russia's national survival. It's for this existential reason that Russia perceives Ukraine not just as a buffer state, but as an indispensable shield against Western encroachment. This rationale explains Russia's armed conflict in Ukraine and its unwillingness to relinquish. Based on cold, calculated geopolitical needs, Russia's objective is to push as much west as possible. Ideally, the Russians would want to occupy the territory up to the Carpathians, which means taking over all of Ukraine. Doing so would reduce Russia's exposed flank from 2,000 to 600 kilometers, a much more manageable vulnerability. This is also why the Soviet Union had drawn its borders as it did, trying to anchor by as many geographic points as possible. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union threw Russia back to its 18th century territorial boundaries. Losing Ukraine to NATO would set Russia back to its 16th century borders. For Russia, the stakes couldn't be higher. This then explains why the Russians keep fighting, regardless of the costs. A NATO-allied Ukraine would crush Russian power. The leadership in Kiev would likely seize the opportunity to exploit the Volgograd Gap. While the consolidation of power wouldn't materialize instantaneously, it would commence a slow but inexorable buildup over decades, significantly shifting the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The strategic repercussions of such a shift would echo across generations, altering the geopolitical landscape in a manner that could hardly be overstated. But there is more. Going further south towards the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula holds the key to reconfiguring Russia's influence in the periphery. The Black Sea has historically served as Russia's gateway connecting Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean and the open oceans. Operating as a crucial nexus linking Europe, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, the Black Sea region is central to Moscow's geo-economic policy. A policy that not only projects power and influence in the Mediterranean, but also increases Southern Europe's reliance on Russian oil and gas. However, ever since Russia lost its Soviet borders, its influence in the region has depended solely on the Crimean Peninsula. But it's not all about economics. Crimea, in many ways, can be described as the soft underbelly of Russian power projection. A concentrated and determined NATO effort to remove Russian control from Crimea would deal a decisive blow to Moscow's capacity to exert influence across the Black Sea. The Crimean Peninsula is a territory brimming with strategic significance. Whoever controls it gains the power to change the rules of the game and fundamentally alter the balance of forces. For instance, Russia's military conquest of South Ukraine would not have been possible without its assets in Crimea. If the roles were reversed, however, if a foreign power were to control Crimea, it would be in a prime position to harass and disrupt the movement of Russian military forces all across the northern Caucasus, especially at the time of closing the Volgograd Gap. Without Crimea, the Russians would have to devote substantially more resources towards defensive measures. This then would demand even more military commitments and resources on top of the 2,000-kilometer exposed front line. That is not a sustainable existence. Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea sent shockwaves across the international stage and amplified tensions in the region. The Crimean Tatars and their unwavering resistance against Russian occupation, backed by Ukraine's resolve, underscore how the peninsula could emerge as a rallying point for undoing Russian power. If Ukraine were to become part of NATO, and Crimea was somehow returned to Ukrainian control, the Black Sea would turn into a NATO lake, a Turkish lake to be more precise, since they have the most competent navy in the region. Either way, Ukraine joining NATO would restrict the operational capacity of the Russian Navy to its territorial waters. In turn, this would weaken Russia's influence over countries historically within its sphere, like Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, countries where Russia backs local separatist movements to gain leverage with the host nations. Should Ukraine join NATO, Russia's separatist holdings in Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Karabakh would collapse like a house of cards. The host nations would then be free to recalibrate their foreign policy needs, moving away from Russian influence and closer to NATO membership. So, Ukraine joining NATO could ignite a domino effect in the periphery. It wouldn't happen instantly, but eventually, in a decade or two, Russia would find itself encircled in a new reality where its demographic and industrial core would be flanked on all sides: the Black Sea, the South Caucasus, and the Caspian Sea. It would be an encirclement Russia wouldn't be able to overcome. All the anti-Russian rhetoric seen in recent years in Europe and elsewhere is building up to a changing geopolitical landscape. Ukraine is set to play a central role in that calculus, and joining NATO would mark a new chapter in its history. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, by invading Ukraine, Russia inadvertently triggered the Ukrainians to chase objectives that had previously been a source of apprehension. Now, tens of thousands of casualties later, bridges have been burnt, hunters have turned into prey, and the Ukrainians are looking to get even. In that pursuit for payback, nations tend to become like the worst, and those they oppose.
I've been your host Shirvan from CaspianReport. All of our content is crowdfunded. If you want to be part of that network and gain access to some premium perks like early access, PDF files, etc., consider joining our platform on Patreon or the YouTube membership program. You'll find the links in the description box. In any case, thank you for your time and Sahol.